Hello everyone, my name is Plessis, and the title of my talk is Embracing the New to Stay Faithful to the Old, subtitled Using Smart Lexicography to Enable Preservation of an Archived Language in its Originally Documented Form, while reflecting modern reanalysis of its phoneme inventory. But before I go any further, I think it might help if I provide a small amount of background information. So the dilemma I'm going to talk about has arisen in the course of making a two-way dictionary, that is for Kham English and English Kham. Kham is a Khoisan language no longer spoken today, though it was documented between 1870 and 1880 by Wilhelm Blake and Lucy Lloyd. And the main reason for its extinction was the systematic displacement and massacre of San communities from about the 1770s onwards. This language belonged to the very small group of closely related varieties that make up the Khoi branch of Khoita, which nowadays is perhaps more commonly referred to as Tu. We have records for these languages spanning almost 2.5 centuries, but for the most part they are extremely limited. The Kham corpus is the most extensive documentation we have of any Khoi language. The speakers who worked with Blake and Lloyd came from the region of, firstly, the Stontberg, and secondly, the Katkop Hills. After Kham, the next most valuable documentation we have for Khoi is the corpus for Ngu, which various scholars have been working on since about 1994. This next slide shows a few of the most conspicuous differences between Kham and Ngu. And just on a side note here, it's become clear to me that Blake and Lloyd's Katkop dialect really fell within the spectrum of the Ngu varieties and should in fact be treated separately from Kham proper. This map shows the historical locations of Ngu speakers in the Langeberg and in the sand dunes directly due north of Kenhart, as well as at the confluence of the Aub and the Nossup rivers. And this brings us to the end of the background section. Next, I'm going to set out the problem. So in an ideal world, I imagine that a lexicographer would be lucky enough to start out with a well-established, linguistically accurate inventory of phonemes already in hand, along with a standard set of orthographic conventions. Of course, this is essential for a rational ordering of entries. And in the case of Kham, the existence of standardized citation forms will also meet the needs of at least two groups of our likely end users, such as language activists who might wish to replenish the greatly depleted lexicon of Ngu, and which they could do by drawing on Kham. Secondly, people seeking information about aspects of their cultural heritage. Almost from the outset, Blake and Lloyd considered the preparation of a dictionary a vital component of their own project, and they methodically created small slips for each new word or grammatical morpheme they encountered. They even began transferring these slips into an early manuscript dictionary. Unfortunately, their dictionary project foundered because Blake and Lloyd lacked a systematic inventory of the phonemes, and really, we can hardly fault them for this. After all, the concept of the phoneme didn't even exist in the 19th century. And what's more, the Khoi languages presented special difficulties of kind not previously encountered. It's unsurprising, really, that the manuscript notebooks of Blake and Lloyd reflect a long and gradual learning process with many early experiments in notation, numerous variant spellings, and an abundance of phonetically narrow diacritic markings. Some of Blake's early attempts involved drawing on Greek, Arabic, and Hebrew symbols because he was attempting to provide a unique symbol for each click plus each one of its possible effluxes or accompaniments. Ultimately, the most reliable records we have are the later ones of Lloyd, and when she came to prepare a selection of texts for publication in the early part of the 20th century, she'd evidently acquired even more confidence. We find the specimens reflects a clear and systematic organization of the phoneme inventory. Even so, the pages still bristle with a multitude of diacritics, and this really brings us to the needs of another group of specialized end users. These are scholars of literature or history who might be seeking to study the texts now for the first time in the original language. Such users are likely to turn back to the manuscripts, for example, for additional material not published in the specimens. And here, these users will certainly need a dictionary that allows them to look up words as they are found in the manuscripts. So I hope I've now given you some idea of the problems that are involved. Now I'd like to turn to their resolution. I think the resolution of the problem and the meeting of the different user needs is going to require, firstly, establishing the phoneme inventory and a standard or at least a regularized orthography to allow for an orderly arrangement of entries by their regular citation forms. And secondly, it's going to involve finding a way that will allow users to look up words as they are found in the manuscripts. Right, so this first part of resolving the problem involves establishing the phoneme inventory, and in order to do this I've used a combination of bottom-up and top-down approaches. For the bottom-up section, I've consulted Blake's own notes, his correspondence and published writings. I've also looked at Lloyd's marginal notes and the final symbols used by her in the specimens. Lastly, I've looked at the phonetic analysis contributed by Dorothea Blake in 1923, which was based on what she had learned directly from her Aunt Lucy Lloyd, plus her familiarity with all those shoeboxes full of dictionary slips, and by this stage also her own fieldwork. And then for the top-down approach, I've undertaken a small amount of comparative cross-query study. I've drawn on modern advances in our theoretical understanding of quiescent phonetics and phonology, with reference particularly to the recent work on Ngu, which itself has been informed by the pioneering work of Tony Trail. And then lastly, I've drawn on the kinds of analytical tools that are available to us nowadays when we use modern lexicographic software. Right, there isn't time for me to go into too much detail, so I'm going to skip more or less over the next two slides. Let me simply say that I have already completed work on the vowels and the diphthongs, as well as the ordinary egress of consonants. Let's skip straight to the ingress of consonants, which are, of course, the clicks, because this is really where the main problems arise. It has been possible to establish the inventory up to a point, but there are still some indeterminacies, particularly when it comes to certain of the click effluxes, which is another term for click accompaniments. So in the remainder of this section, I'd like briefly to illustrate some of these difficulties with reference to the click effluxes written by Blake and Lloyd, as you see here. The three symbols in particular are the one which I will call the K breves, and then the KH and the high. This, firstly, we're going to look at the phonetic value of Lloyd's efflux symbol, represented here with the two small breves, the K, we can call it K breves or the K iron. This particular accompaniment is indicated in the notebooks by various adaptations of the Hebrew iron and the Arabic iron. And the adaptations include use of the small Greek letter gamma, usually for the Hebrew iron, and a reversed version of the symbol for the Arabic iron. And then later still, Blake substituted two small breves for the same symbol. You can see that in the extract below. Now, whereas Blake's own commentaries suggest that there was a single phoneme involved, Lloyd's usage in 1911 implied that the two different symbols marked an actual phonemic contrast. So here I've set out the 9 click effluxes as Lloyd distinguished them in 1911. And I've used the post-alveolar click here as the example, and you find the same series of effluxes with all of the other clicks except the bilabial, which occurs only with those ones I've put in parentheses. Right, let's compare that now with the 8 effluxes established by Dorothea later in 1923. As you can see, the one that is missing is the efflux represented by the little breves or various versions of the iron. So Dorothea Blake has evidently concluded that there was no contrast involved, and she has silently omitted that from her table. In fact, there are various reasons for us to accept that Dorothea Blake was correct in her revision. So firstly, if you look through the manuscript notebooks and the dictionary slips, we do find a high level of interchangeability of the different effluxes, whether they're written with that version of the iron with the little breves, or with a gamma, or in some cases a K apostrophe. These examples here show more instances of the variability of these symbols. Secondly, we can confirm Dorothea Blake's revision by undertaking a small amount of comparative study. If we look at cognate items in ngu, we find that the corresponding efflux is in fact the affricated uvular ejective, which in ngu they represent by means of the X apostrophe. We can further confirm it by undertaking a small amount of statistical analysis, which turns up a complementary distribution pattern for the efflux represented by the breves or the iron and the gamma, or sometimes also represented by the K apostrophe. So this graph shows the distribution of the clicks by their basic positional type. And you'll see there that the tallest column represents the post-alveolar click. Now, if the effluxes are evenly distributed across all clicks, except, as always, the bilabial, then we might expect to see a similar curve for each of the individual effluxes. So in this graph now, I've set out the distributions of each of the effluxes. And you will notice there in the case of nasalization and voicing, the curves more or less match the one that we saw earlier for the overall distribution of clicks, where in these two cases, the tallest column, the one in yellow, represents the post-alveolar click. But now here what we see in this slide is that the effluxes indicated by the K with the iron are most often associated with the orange and grey columns, which are the dental and lateral clicks, while effluxes represented by a gamma, or actually sometimes also the K apostrophe, are associated with the yellow and blue columns, which stand for the alveolar and the palatoalveolar clicks. And now, let's move on. I'd like to give you a second illustration of some of the difficulties, this time focusing on the phonetic values of Lloyd's symbols, efflux symbols, written by her as KH and Chi. Now, in this instance, Dorothea Blake preserved Lloyd's original contrast, except that she substituted a normal X for the Chi. So now the question arises, what was the phonetic contrast involved? For one thing, it is problematic that we find KH and Chi used pretty much interchangeably in the manuscripts, and we even find that Wilhelm Blake sometimes also used additional variants such as an XH or a KX. In fact, there may well have been an actual distinction involved. In his second report on his researches, Blake mentioned that he and Lloyd had been very materially assisted in properly distinguishing the clicks and other sounds by Henry Tyndall. And if we turn to Tyndall's own study of Nama, we find that he explained the distinction between two of his conventions as set out here. His GH represented what he called a soft guttural, whereas the KH represented a much deeper and harsher guttural than GH. In fact, we find that Tyndall himself really used only KH in combination with click symbols to indicate an efflux, and he kept the GH for the independent consonant represented by X in the modern orthography for the Namibian Quakerey languages. In other words, this is really the velar fricative. But even so, it's possible that it was Tyndall's distinction that prompted Blake and Lloyd to find a contrast between two kinds of fricative click efflux. And really, it is this likelihood that guided the interpretation of the efflux inventories of Lloyd and Dorothea Blake, as I set them out for you earlier. So here, I've just once again set out for you the 8 click effluxes of come, except that this time I've made it explicit how I arrived at my interpretations of the 2 different fricated clicks. What we can do next is we can now take this table and compare it with the effluxes of ngu. So here you see the 10 click effluxes as determined for ngu. Here I've put the 2 tables side by side, and I've highlighted for you the 2 correlations we would expect to find. So firstly, if the interpretation is correct, we would expect to find a correlation between the come click efflux written by Blake and Lloyd as KH and the ngu efflux represented by the QH, which is the aspirated uvula. And this correlation is indeed found, but it's not consistent. Secondly, if we are right again, we would expect to find the come efflux written as the high, Dorothea Blake's X, to correspond to the ngu X. And again, there certainly are cases where this predicted correlation is borne out, but then again, there are many where it is not. In this case, it does look as though part of the problem really lies with the proposed inventory of the ngu click effluxes. For one thing, it's doubtful, when we're looking at ngu, that the phonetic distinction between the click effluxes of simple aspiration and simple frication really is phonemically significant. And in my view, if the simple fricated clicks exist at all as a separate class, this is most probably the result of burrowing. However, I don't want to dwell on this because, after all, I feel it is for my colleagues to resolve, and I certainly have mentioned the issue to them. Turning back to come, it certainly is possible that the effluxes represented separately, yet so often interchangeably, by the KH and the chi are in some cases equally not contrastive, and perhaps they similarly correspond to the ngu variable between the aspiration, the simple aspiration and frication. Nevertheless, as we have seen, there are indeed a few cases where the come KH matches the ngu QH. Of course, there is still plenty more work that needs to be done, but for now we can summarize the uncertainties as I've set them out in the table on the next slide. And lastly, this brings us to the second part of our resolution of the problem, which involves embracing the new to stay faithful to the old. And the vision is that digital technology will make it possible to accommodate the needs of all users by allowing a regular ordering of entries in terms of standardized citation forms, but at the same time still reflecting and being able to retrieve all variants encountered in the manuscripts. So, for purposes of electronic lookup, English, a letter picker menu will offer the user all of the variants that he or she is likely to find in the manuscripts, such as the clicks written with the accompanying symbols of that K iron, or the high, a KH, and even a K gamma or a KX. And then the software will simply direct the user automatically to the standardized form with this entry. And with that entry, the user will also find a wealth of other information. Thank you. These are just a couple of acknowledgements, especially to Stias and my home department of linguistics at Stellenbosch. And I'd like to leave you with an invitation. Thank you again.